All right, so for all you pastors and Bible study leaders out there, you, we got to keep things fresh, right?
Hmm.
Especially when we're talking about those passages everyone's heard a million times.
Yeah, like 2 Peter 3:9.
Exactly. You think you've heard it all, and then you stumble across a sermon that just blows you away with a totally new perspective.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've
Yeah.
got a whole stack of sermons from pastors all over the place, different backgrounds, different denominations, and they're all tackling 2 Peter 3:9 in some seriously creative ways.
I mean, you'd think there's only so much you can say about one verse, right? But these pastors, they really dug deep and came up with some unique interpretations and illustrations that I think are going to be super helpful for anyone who's trying to teach this passage.
One of the things that really jumped out at me was how many of these sermons focused on the idea of God's patience.
Yeah, that's a classic theme for this verse.
Right. But they didn't just stay at the surface level, you know? It
Right.
wasn't just God is patient, so we should be patient too.
They actually went deeper into the why behind God's patience.
Exactly. They explored the Greek word makrothumia, which is often translated as patience, but it's so much richer than that.
Okay, so break that down for us. What's so special about this Makrothumia?
Well, it's not just about waiting around. It's about this active, purposeful patience that's rooted in love.
Okay, so it's not passive.
Yeah.
It's like God's not just sitting back and watching the clock tick. He's actively engaged.
Exactly. And that active engagement, it's driven by his love for humanity. It's a love that's willing to wait, to endure, to persevere, because it knows that ultimately redemption is coming.
I love that. So how did these pastors actually illustrate this concept of macrosumia? Because it can be a bit abstract, you know?
Oh, they got super creative.
Hmm.
Some used personal anecdotes, some drew on historical events, and some even used pop culture references to make this ancient concept relatable to a modern audience.
Okay, spill the beans. Give us some examples.
All right, so one that really stood out to me was this sermon from Friesland Community Church. They talked about this tension between God's justice and mercy and how macrothumia allows space for grace to be extended.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down a little more.
So on the one hand, you have God's holiness, his righteousness, his demand for justice.
Right, because sin has consequences.
Exactly. But at the same time, you have his incredible love, his compassion, his desire for all people to be saved.
Yeah.
And that's where macrothumia comes in. It's like God chooses to hold back his judgment, not because he's weak, but because his love is so vast.
So it's not that God is ignoring sin or pretending it doesn't matter. It's that he's choosing to give people time to repent, to turn back to him.
Exactly. And that's a really powerful message because it means that none of us are beyond the reach of God's grace.
No matter how far we've strayed or how much we've messed up.
God is still patiently waiting for us with open arms.
That's beautiful. And I think it really speaks to the heart of what 2 Peter 3:9 is all about. It's not just about God's patience, it's about his love, his mercy, his desire for us to come home.
Absolutely. And I think these sermons really highlighted that in a way that's both theologically sound and incredibly moving.
So tell me, what other creative illustrations do these pastors use to bring this concept to life? Because I'm always looking for fresh ideas.
Well, one that really blew me away was from Northside Community Church in Zimbabwe. They connected God's macrothumia to the anticipation we experience during Advent.
Wait, hold on. Connecting patience to Advent. That's interesting. How did they make that work?
They basically reframed the whole idea of waiting for Christmas. Instead of seeing it as this passive waiting period, they argued that we should view it as a time when God is actively present, preparing our hearts for Christ's coming. So the delay isn't really a delay at all. It's God's purposeful presence.
Wow, I've never thought of it like that. It's like we're not just waiting for a date on the calendar. We're waiting for a person, a savior. And that waiting, it's not empty. It's filled with God's presence.
Right. And I think that perspective can really transform how we view Advent and maybe even how we view those times in our own lives when it feels like God is silent or distant.
Yeah, because maybe those times of waiting aren't really about God being absent. Maybe it's about him working behind the scenes, preparing us for something greater than we can imagine.
Exactly. And that's where macrothumia comes in. It's about trusting that God is working even when we can't see it. It's about believing that his timing is perfect even when it doesn't make sense to us.
So it's a call to faith, to trust, to hope, even in the midst of uncertainty.
Exactly. And that's a message that I think we all need to hear, especially in today's world where everything seems so chaotic and unpredictable.
All right, so we've talked about the theological depth of macrothumia, and we've seen some amazing illustrations from these sermons. But how does this all connect to our everyday lives as pastors and Bible study leaders? Like, how do we actually put this into practice?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And that's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive. We're going to look at some practical tips and strategies for cultivating macrothumia in our own lives and ministries.
So stay tuned, folks. We're just getting started.
So, we've been talking about God's macrothumia, this active, loving patience, and how it's way more than just waiting around.
Yeah, it's like this deep well of God's character. It's
Yeah.
rooted in his love, his mercy, his unwavering commitment to his people.
And for us as pastors and Bible study leaders, it's not just something to admire from afar, it's something we're called to embody in our own lives and ministries.
Right. It's got to move from our heads to our hearts and then out into our actions. How do we actually lead with macrothumia?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And I think it starts with recognizing that ministry is a marathon, not a sprint.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah.
We live in a culture of instant gratification, and it can be so easy to get discouraged when we don't see immediate results.
It's like we want to see people's lives transformed overnight, churches growing exponentially, problems solved instantly.
But that's not always realistic, is it?
Not usually. And that's where macrothumia comes in. It's about trusting that God is working, even when we can't see it. It's about being faithful in the small things in the day-to-day, even when it feels like we're not making a difference.
One of the sermons that really stuck with me on this point was from South End Baptist Church. They used this great analogy of a parent teaching their kid to ride a bike.
I love that analogy. You can picture the parent running alongside the bike, holding on, encouraging the child, even when they wobble and fall.
And the parent doesn't give up, even though it would be so much easier to just let the kid stay on training wheels forever.
Right. They keep showing up day after day, patiently guiding and supporting the child until they finally get it.
And you can just see the joy on the parent's face when that kid finally takes off on their own. Like all that patience, all that effort, it was all worth it.
Exactly. And I think that's a powerful picture of what it means to lead with macrothumia.
It's about being that steady presence, that constant source of encouragement, even when progress is slow or setbacks happen.
It's about remembering that growth takes time and that God is working in ways we may not always see or understand.
So practically speaking, how do we apply that to ministry? What does it actually look like to lead with macrothumia?
Well, it might mean being patient with someone who's struggling with the same sin over and over again. Not giving up on them, but continuing to walk alongside them, offering grace and truth.
Or maybe it means continuing to invest in a ministry that's not growing as fast as you'd like. Trusting that God has a plan, even when it's not immediately apparent.
It could also mean pouring into relationships that don't seem to be going anywhere, or maybe just being present with someone who's going through a difficult time, even when you don't have all the answers.
And sometimes it's just about resisting that urge to fix everything right away.
Yeah, that can be tough. Especially for us pastors and Bible study leaders, we're often wired to be problem solvers. But sometimes the best thing we can do is just be present to listen, to offer a shoulder to cry on.
It's about recognizing that sometimes the greatest growth happens in those seasons of waiting and perseverance.
And I think that's where 2 Peter 3:9 really comes alive for us. It's a reminder that God is patient with us, even in our mess-ups and our slow progress.
And if he's patient with us, surely we could extend that same grace to others.
Absolutely. And not only can we, but we must. Because that's what it means to reflect the heart of God.
One thing that really struck me as we were digging into these sermons was how many of them emphasize the connection between macrothumia and love.
That's so important. You can't really have one without the other.
Like Bethel Baptist Church talked about how macrothumia isn't just about waiting, it's about waiting with love.
Yes, it's about enduring with grace, persevering with compassion, and hoping with expectation.
And that's so different from the way the world views patience.
Oh, absolutely. The world sees patience as weakness, like passivity.
But in God's kingdom, patience, it's a sign of strength, a sign of love, a deep trust in God's timing.
It's about choosing to believe the best about people, even when they're at their worst.
It's about seeing their potential, even when they can't see it themselves.
And that kind of love, it takes macrothumia. It takes a willingness to stick with people, to walk alongside them in their journeys, even when those journeys are messy and unpredictable.
We've talked a lot about being patient with others, but I think sometimes we forget that God is also patient with us.
Oh, that's so true. We're often way harder on ourselves than we are on anyone else.
We beat ourselves up for our mistakes.
Yeah.
We get impatient with our own progress, and we forget that we're on a journey too.
We're all works in progress, right? And that's where self-compassion comes in. It's about recognizing that we're human, that we're going to make mistakes, and that's okay.
We need to give ourselves the same grace and patience that we extend to others.
Exactly. And it's not about lowering our standards or becoming complacent.
It's about recognizing that growth takes time and that we're not going to get everything right all the time.
And that's okay. God is patient with us, and we need to be patient with ourselves.
This whole idea of self-compassion, I think it's especially crucial for pastors and Bible study leaders. We're often carrying a lot of weight on our shoulders,
Yeah, we put so much pressure on ourselves to be perfect, to have all the answers, to never make a mistake.
and that kind of pressure, it can lead to burnout, resentment, even despair.
But 2 Peter 3:9, it reminds us that God's not looking for perfection. He's looking for faithfulness.
He's looking for hearts that are willing to surrender to his will, to trust his timing, and to persevere even when things get tough.
And that kind of faithfulness, it takes patience, both with ourselves and with God.
So let's talk about that for a minute. How does 2 Peter 3:9 inform our approach to prayer, to seeking God's will, to waiting on his timing?
That's a great question, because I think sometimes we have this warped view of what it means to wait on the Lord.
Like we think it means being passive, sitting on the sidelines, waiting for God to wave his magic wand and make everything better.
But real waiting on the Lord, it's active. It's an engagement with his presence.
It's about seeking his guidance, listening for his voice, aligning our hearts with his will.
And that takes Makrothumia. It takes a willingness to surrender our own timelines and agendas.
And to trust that God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't make sense to us.
Calvary Chapel, their sermon had a really cool take on this. They talked about how waiting on the Lord isn't just about waiting for an answer. It's about being transformed in the waiting.
Oh, I love that. It's not just about getting what we want. It's about becoming who God wants us to be.
Exactly. It's about allowing the waiting to shape us, to refine us, to draw us closer to him.
And that can be a painful process
It can be, but it's also beautiful.
because it's in that waiting, that surrendering, that trusting that we really experience God's love and grace.
Another sermon that hit me hard was from First Presbyterian Church. They talked about the importance of persistent prayer even when we don't see immediate answers.
I remember that one. They use the image of Jacob wrestling with God,
Yeah.
refusing to let go until he received a blessing.
Right. And the point is, God's not some reluctant judge who needs to be badgered into answering our prayers.
He's a loving Father who delights in our persistence, who wants us to come boldly before his throne and pour out our hearts to him.
But sometimes those answers come in ways we don't expect and on timelines we don't understand.
And that's where Makrothumia comes back into play. It's about continuing to pray, continuing to seek God's face, even when we don't see immediate results.
It's about trusting that he hears us, that he cares, and that he's working behind the scenes even when we can't see it.
And that kind of trust, it doesn't happen overnight, does it?
It's a journey, for sure,
Yeah.
not a destination.
And it's a journey that requires patience both with God and with ourselves.
As we go deeper into Makrothumia, I'm struck by how countercultural it is.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in a world that's obsessed with speed efficiency, instant gratification, patience can feel like a weakness.
But 2 Peter 3:9 tells us it's actually a superpower even.
It's a weapon against the anxieties and pressures of our culture.
It's a source of peace and stability in a world that's constantly in flux.
And it's a powerful witness to the transformative power of God's grace.
Because when we practice patience, we're demonstrating that we trust in a power that's bigger than ourselves, a power that's not bound by time or circumstance.
And that's a message that our world desperately needs to hear, don't you think?
Definitely. Redeemer Church had this really cool analogy in their sermon. They talked about a potter shaping a clay pot.
Oh, yeah. That was a good one. They talked about how the potter has to be patient with the clay, gently molding and shaping it until it's ready to be fired in the kiln.
And if the potter rushes the process, the pot will crack and break.
And they connected that to our spiritual formation, saying that God is the potter and we are the clay.
He's patiently working in our lives, shaping us, molding us, refining us.
And if we try to rush the process, if we get impatient with God's timing, we risk breaking under the pressure.
But if we surrender to his hands, if we trust his process, we can become vessels of honor fit for his use.
And that takes Makrothumia.
It takes a willingness to embrace the waiting, to trust the process, and to believe that God is working all things together for our good.
And speaking of embracing the waiting, one of the sermons that really challenged me was from Grace Fellowship Church. They talk about how patience isn't just about enduring difficult circumstances. It's also about savoring the good times.
Oh, that's so important. We can get so caught up in rushing from one thing to the next that we forget to enjoy the moment,
They use this great analogy of a kid eating a piece of candy. They said that a kid who's impatient will just gobble it down in one bite, barely tasting it.
But a kid who's patient We'll savor each lick, enjoying the sweetness for as long as possible.
And the point is, we should approach life like that, savoring each moment, appreciating the good things God has given us, and not always rushing ahead to the next thing.
That's a beautiful picture of what it means to live a life of macrothumia.
It's about being present, being grateful, and finding joy in the journey.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to encourage all of us to think about how we can cultivate more patience in our lives and ministries.
Let's not just talk about it. Let's actually practice it.
Let's be patient with the people we serve, patient with ourselves, and patient with God.
Because in that patience, we'll discover a depth of peace, joy, and fulfillment that the world can't offer.
And we'll become more like Christ, who is the ultimate model of macrothumia.
So we've been talking about Makrothumia and all the different ways these pastors have been using it.
This active, loving kind of patience that we see in 2 Peter 3:9.
But the question is, how do we actually get more patience? It's one thing to talk about it, but actually living it out, that's a whole other challenge.
Oh, yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. It's like we can admire patience in other people, but when it comes to our own lives, it's like, Lord, give me patience, but I need it right now.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
where do we even start? Like, how do we move from theory to practice?
Well, in that sermon from Northside Community Church in Zimbabwe, they talked about Advent and how it's not just about passively waiting for Christmas.
Right. It's about actively preparing our hearts for Christ's coming.
Exactly. And I think that's a good starting point for us. It's about being intentional about creating space in our lives for cultivating patience.
Okay, so it's not just going to happen magically. We have to make a conscious effort.
Right. It's like tending a garden. You have to create the right conditions for things to grow.
So maybe the first step is to figure out what our own patience triggers are. Those things that make us lose our cool.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Like, what are those situations or those people that tend to push your buttons? Once you know what they are, you can start to develop strategies for responding in a more patient way.
For me, I know that I get really impatient when I feel rushed. So I try to build more margin into my schedule,
Mm-hmm.
leave early for appointments, that kind of thing.
That makes sense. And those strategies are going to look different for everyone. For some people, it might be about creating a quiet space for prayer and reflection each morning.
Or maybe setting boundaries around your work hours so you don't get burned out.
It's about finding what works for you and then being intentional about creating those spaces where patience can flourish.
Speaking of growing things, one of the sermons that really spoke to me was from Desert Springs Church. They talked about how cultivating patience is a lot like cultivating a crop.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one. They talked about how farmers have to be patient, tending the soil, planting the seeds, waiting for the rain, and then waiting even longer for the harvest.
Right. And the point is that spiritual growth is kind of like that. It takes time, patience, and consistent effort.
And just like a farmer has to deal with weeds and pests and unpredictable weather, we're going to face challenges and setbacks on our own spiritual journeys.
But the key is to keep tending the soil of our hearts, to keep nurturing those seeds of faith, and to trust that God will bring the growth in His time.
And one of the best ways to do that, I think, is through the practice of gratitude.
Oh, absolutely. When we focus on the good things in our lives, it changes our whole perspective.
It's like that saying, gratitude turns what we have into enough. And when we feel like we have enough, we're less likely to get impatient for more.
So maybe start a gratitude journal. Make a habit of thanking people more often, or just take a few moments each day to appreciate the beauty around you.
Those are great ideas. One of the simplest but most powerful pieces of advice I heard from these sermons was to just slow down.
Oh yeah, that's huge. In our culture, we're so used to rushing from one thing to the next that we forget to just be present.
It's like we're always on fast forward and we miss out on the beauty of the present moment.
So how do we actually slow down? Like, what does that look like in practice?
Well, it might mean saying no to some commitments, delegating tasks, or just choosing to be more present in the moment.
Like putting your phone away during meals, taking a walk in nature without any distractions, or really listening to someone without interrupting or thinking about what you're going to say next.
Those are great examples. It's about creating space for stillness and reflection in our lives. Those pockets of quiet where we can reconnect with ourselves and with God.
And in that stillness, I think that's where patience can really take root.
It's like we're creating the space for those seeds of macrothumia to germinate and grow.
And one thing I've learned is that we don't have to do this alone.
Oh, absolutely not. We need each other. We need community.
We need people who will encourage us, challenge us, and remind us of the truth when we're struggling.
We need safe spaces where we can be honest about our impatience, ask for prayer, and lift each other up.
And that's one of the beautiful things about ministry. We're not meant to do it in isolation.
Yeah.
We have each other, and we have the Holy Spirit to guide us.
So reach out to your fellow pastors, your mentors, your friends, and ask for support. Share your struggles and encourage one another.
Because in that shared journey, we'll find the strength and grace to keep going, to keep cultivating patience, and to keep reflecting God's macrothumia to the world.
As we wrap up this deep dive into 2 Peter 3:9, I hope you're leaving with a renewed sense of purpose and inspiration.
I hope you're feeling challenged and encouraged to live out this concept of macrothumia in your own lives and ministries.
Remember, macrothumia, it's not just a nice idea, it's a powerful force that can transform us from the inside out.
It's a gift from God, and it's a gift we can share with the world.
So go out there and be patient. Be patient with yourselves, be patient with others, and be patient with God.
And trust that in His perfect timing, He will bring beauty from ashes and make all things new. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into 2 Peter 3:9.